On October 7, 2023, the terrorist group Hamas led an assault on military and civilian targets in Israel. In atrocious and barbaric actions, they massacred, tortured, raped, and wounded innocents. 1,195 Israelis died, including 815 civilians, and 251 were taken hostage. In a predictable manner, Israel answered with a large-scale assault in Gaza, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths and the destruction of a large part of Gaza's infrastructure. It is one of the most destructive wars which involved Israel, but only the last in the long list for the Arab-Israeli conflict, which began before the country's foundation. From the establishment of Jewish settlers in Palestine, and especially since Israel was founded, it was seen as an affront by several Arab countries and communities who partly established their nationalism in opposition to Israel. Few issues inspired as much passion as this one: how to reconcile Israel's quest for security and identity, Palestinian self-government's aspirations, and for Arab countries, a search for policies compatible with perceptions of historical and religious imperatives. I'll go over the conflict's complete history, beginning with the end of the Ottoman Empire, then the British Protectorate, Israel's creation, the many wars it had with its neighbors and Palestinians, as well as public or secret negotiations which were tried for a century to reach a peace settlement which never seemed to come. I'll warn you, this is a very controversial topic, obviously, and probably emotional for some, but here I'll be criticizing all sides, so you can be sure I'll offend some people. At the beginning of the 20th century, Palestine was the poorest Ottoman province. Most Arab inhabitants came from neighboring provinces. There were in 1914 50,000 Jews, a tenth of the population. There was since the end of the 19th century a Zionist campaign by thinkers such as Theodor Herzl to promote a return to Israel for descendants of the Jewish diaspora from 2 millennia ago. The Ottomans didn't take kindly to this. David Ben-Gurion, for example, settled there in 1906. He was expelled by the Ottomans. When he told that to a young Arab student friend, the latter told him that as a friend he was sorry, but as an Arab nationalist he was glad. The Ottomans, as we know, were beaten by the British during the Great War. Before the victory, Secretary Lord Balfour wrote on November 2nd to Lord Rothschild that his government was positive to the idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine as long as it didn't prejudice the religious or civil rights of the non-Jews. The British didn't know what they were getting into. On December 9, 1917, the British entered Jerusalem. General Allenby declared on the 11th that he wasn't there as a conqueror, but as a liberator going forward to a new era of peace in the region. The Arabs who thought of winning their independence were disappointed when the League of Nations gave the British the mandate for administrating Palestine and Iraq, and France for Syria and Lebanon. There was already agitation in Palestine with prior hatred against Jews. The Jews often bought land from big landowners, often leaving the Arabs destitute. Jewish businesses employed mostly Jewish workers and traded among themselves. There were already in 1919 Arab attacks on Jewish villages, and the Jews created self-defense militias like the Haganah. Some revisionists like Jabotinsky wanted to go further with the combat movement for independence, which led him to create the Betar, a fascist-inspired organization, in 1923. The Betar wanted to respond to Arab attacks with its own and strike the British as well. We thus had an explosive situation, and rumors could provoke hate violence. After a rumor in 1929 saying that Jews killed Arabs in Jerusalem, 64 Jews were killed and 54 wounded in Hebron. The British police and Arab neighbors helped save 480 people. Hebron Jews left the city they were installed in for centuries. 133 Jews and 116 Arabs died in 1929. Each side accused the British of favoring the other. With Arab violence, the British thought of limiting Jewish immigration. The Arabs saw Jewish population growth as threatening. In 1922, there was 650,000 Muslims and 87,000 Jews. In 1935, it was 960,000 Muslims and 400,000 Jews. Ben-Gurion, who was part of the 18th Zionist Congress, wanted to get along with the Arabs for equal representation in a new state, but to no avail. The Arab Revolt began in the spring of 1936 with 11 assassinated Jewish civilians. The Arab High Committee realized its inferiority and declared a ceasefire, but terrorism continued. The Jews, notably Ben Gurion's Haganah, showed restraint at the beginning to avoid antagonizing the British. By October, there had been 80 Jews, 200 Arabs, and 30 British killed. Lord Peel was sent by London to examine the situation, and his report rejected Arab accusations, advised to diminish Jewish immigration, with the possibility of separating the country in two. The Arabs would get 75% of the land, but refused in principle. Ben Gurion was satisfied, but the Betar and other extremists were outraged. Germany and Italy accused the British of Zionist imperialism, and some Arabs waved their flags. The irony is that the British wanted to appease the Arabs by limiting Jewish immigration, while the Palestinian leadership was more on the German side, who wanted to encourage Jewish immigration to Palestine. In the spring of 1937, the Irgun was created and would respond with reprisals to Arab attacks. The group began on July 4, 1938 with an attack on Arab vehicles. One attacker was Yitzhak Shamir, who would become Prime Minister 45 years later. There was no terrorism on both sides. The Irgun killed 73 people and injured hundreds in a few days. Socialist Zionists like Ben Gurion condemned this and helped the British to arrest extremists. On August 26, a bomb by the Irgun killed 24 and injured 35. The government decided to limit annual Jewish immigration to 10,000 and forbid selling them land. After the start of World War II, the Irgun negotiated a ceasefire with the British. Palestine Jews would mobilize against the common enemy. The Arabs mostly stayed on the sides. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, openly pro-Nazi, was in exile. The British, though, continued to block Jewish immigration, even blocking ships at sea. The Irgun split in 1940, with militants led by Avraham Stern founding the Stern Group, or Lehi. They assassinated the British minister in 1944. Stern said that the people of Israel were a chosen people and the Arabs were strangers. He wanted allies against the British and ironically contacted the Nazis. He was killed by the police in 1942. With the Nazi capitulation, the full extent of the Jewish people's greatest tragedy was revealed. The Attlee British government wouldn't change its restrictive policy though, and the Haganah broke its alliance. Ben Gurion allied with the Irgun and Lehi to create a united resistance movement. British soldiers were now targeted even on leave. There was no political situation in view, and the country was becoming an armed camp. The Americans were split. Truman, under pressure from the Congress, wanted 100,000 more immigrants admitted, while the Pentagon and oil interests were pro-Arab. It was a frustrating war for the British, who mostly conducted cordon and search. On May 1, 1946, the Anglo-American Commission recommended quickly admitting 100,000 more refugees. London refused, and on June 17, the URM blew up all bridges bordering the country. The Mandate government decided it was too much and launched Operation Agatha on June 29. 2,718 people from the Haganah and the Palma were detained, and dozens of people caches were found. On July 22, armed men went to the King David Hotel, which housed some British leadership, and placed a bomb which killed 91 and injured 70. The British had up to 100,000 men at the time. London was tired and gave the Palestine case to the UN in 1947. Despite of that, attacks were continuing, notably with kidnappings. On March 31, the Haifa refinery was attacked, leading to an enormous fire. The Lehi hanged its hostages and booby-trapped the corpses. On the other side, the Arabs High Committee committed the mistake of boycotting the US Partition Commission. The Arab League, a recent creation, threatened to help Palestinians with armed attacks against the partition. The UNSCOP proposed its partition plan in August 1947. The Zionists, except Irgun and Lehi, agreed. The plan was adopted by the General Assembly on November 29. Immediately after, a bus carrying Jews was attacked by Arabs in Jerusalem, resulting in 7 deaths. It was the beginning of a Jew-Arab military confrontation. The British at this point weren't even interfering, announcing that their mandate would end in May 1948. In 2 weeks, 93 Arabs, 84 Jews, and 7 British were killed. There were battles for several towns in the country. The Jews managed to take Deir Yassin, but with a massacre. The Lehi and Irgun blew up houses and shot everything that moved. The first civilian body count was 250, with many women and children. Jewish institutions condemned the massacre, but the Arabs did not forget. On April 25, the Irgun bombed Jaffa near Tel Aviv with mortars to push the population out. With the British withdrawal on May 14, 1948, Ben Gurion declared the creation of the State of Israel, promising freedom and social equality for all its inhabitants. The Americans and Soviets quickly recognized the country. With With this independence declaration, neighboring Arab countries intervened militarily, saying they wanted to reestablish law and order. In principle, there were 600,000 Jews against 40 million Arabs, but the Arab unity was just a front. There was no coordination, and their armed forces were miserable. The Jordanian Arab Legion, the best among the Arab armies, had 4,500 men involved at the beginning of the conflict. Syria had 3,000, Egypt 10,000, Lebanon 1,000, and Iraq 3,000. On the Israeli side, the Haganah had 36,000 men, but only 400 full-time. The Irgun had 1,500 men, and Lehi half of that. The Israelis had few heavy weapons, but had combat experience and were fighting for their survival. Arab leaders were expecting an easy win. It began well for them, with the Jordanians taking East Jerusalem. The three main combat areas were Jerusalem, the road leading to Tel Aviv, and the plains of Esdraelon and Galilee. The UN, with negotiator Count Bernadotte, announced a ceasefire on June 11, but the propositions were rejected by both sides. Ben-Gurion took advantage of the truce to reorganize his forces with weapons brought from Czechoslovakia. Fighting resumed on July 9. Moshe Dayan, commanding a commando battalion, captured the Jordanian Armored Corps and managed to take the towns of Lida and Ramleh with it. On July 18, Bernadotte negotiated another ceasefire but was assassinated by Lehi. This event led to the dissolution of Irgun and Lehi and their absorption in a newly combined force called Sahal. The Israelis launched an operation to take the Negev, took the port of Eilat, and sunk an Egyptian capital ship. They also pushed back the Syrians in the north. Syria was in the midst of a revolution, and Iraq announced it was leaving the war on March 13, 1949. Egypt was also brought by the Americans towards an armistice. Cairo would control the Gaza Strip. The final armistice with Jordan, which would keep the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem, was signed on April 3. Israel had expanded its area of partition in comparison to the UN plan. The Israelis had showed their determination, endurance, and ingenuity. They had lost 4,017 soldiers and 2,000 civilians. The Israeli forces had up to 100,000 men, well equipped and led. Among their opponents, only the Jordanian Arab Legion genuinely fought, with 10,000 men at the end of the war. The other countries had a total of 45,000 men. The Arab world was in shock with the defeat. Ben-Gurion said that the war was won not because the Jews were the better combatants, but because the Arabs were worse. The population of Jordan tripled with the immigration and annexation, with now a majority being Palestinians. Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria didn't want to integrate the Palestinians and force them to stay in temporary refugee camps to encourage them to go back home. Ben-Gurion had other plans and wanted to establish a solid Jewish majority on the territory. Tzahal pushed out 750,000 Arabs towards Gaza, the West Bank, and other countries. The Palestinians called this event a Nakba. On his relations with the Palestinians, Ben-Gurion said, "There is no solution on this question. There's an abyss between us and nothing can fill it." The Arab-Israeli conflict would not be based so much on concrete interests and calculated strategies, but rather on ideology, religion, and mythology. Its irrational nature is a big reason why it lasted for so long. Israel would be the focus of grievances from neighboring countries. Immediately after the war, Israel started secret negotiations with other countries, mainly Jordan, and even with Palestinian committees. In private, leaders were more open and respectful, but limited by passions and ideologies. Very often, proposals for compromise on each side were considerable, but negotiations would often fail and lead to a hard status quo. King Abdallah lost his domestic support, and other Arab countries accused him of treason for trying to negotiate. He said in June 1951 to an American, "I am an old man. I know my power is limited. I know that my own son Talal hates me. I know that my own people doesn't trust me because of my peace efforts. I also know that I could conclude a peace effort if only I had a little help and encouragement. I don't have much time left and I don't want to die with a broken heart." On July 20, he was assassinated by a Palestinian militant close to the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. In December 1949, the UN voted for the internationalization of Jerusalem, much to the chagrin of everybody in the region. US President Truman didn't like the way the Israelis managed the refugee problem, which destabilized the region during the Cold War. He even threatened to revise support for Israel and said Israel should respect the 1947 Partition Plan. Ben-Gurion replied that the country wasn't born from the Partition Plan, but rather from the sacrifices of its population. There were already Palestinian attacks on Israelis. On October 13, 1953, an Israeli woman and her two children were killed by infiltrated men. Since the independence, 124 civilians had been killed this way. Israel approved the reprisal operation against the Jordanian village of Kibbur. The commando took the village, scared the locals away, and blew up the houses. They didn't verify carefully, and people were still hiding in them, resulting in 69 deaths. The Americans, under Eisenhower, tried to establish peace in the region, but disputes resulted in failure. The new Egyptian leader Nasser was arming with Czechoslovakia since 1955. Ben-Gurion asked the US for military supplies to compensate, but Eisenhower refused. The French agreed because they thought Egypt contributed to the war in Algeria and wanted Israel to support them in the war against Nasser. They sent weapons and even a secret nuclear reactor. With Nasser's rising popularity, Israel saw him as a threat. Israel had absorbed hundreds of thousands of immigrants and wanted to quickly become an economic power with financial help from Jews abroad, West German reparations, and the US. Nasser was increasingly threatening. He nationalized the Suez Canal in the summer of 1956, much to the chagrin of the British. He formed a military pact in April with Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and in October with Jordan and Syria. He even cut Israeli access to the Gulf of Aqaba with a naval blockade, thus cutting them from access to oil. Israel's forces were becoming increasingly professional and well-equipped. Israel wanted to prepare for war against Egypt to neutralize Gaza and the Fedayeen who were conducting raids, and ensure freedom of navigation. London and Paris wanted a war against Egypt for the reasons I mentioned. Their plan was for Israel to attack the Sinai, and then for them to announce a ceasefire ultimatum which they knew Egypt would refuse, and use that as a pretext to intervene militarily themselves. Operations began on October 29, 1956. Sahal quickly took Gaza and advanced in the Sinai with armed columns and paratroopers led by Ariel Sharon, who would become PM almost 50 years later, behind enemy lines. The subordinates of General Dayan, architect of the operations plan, were really aggressive and went beyond their objectives. The two Western countries announced their ultimatum on the 31st, and on November the 5th began their paratrooper and amphibious attacks on Port Said. Militarily, this was a considerable success, especially for Israel, but politically, it was a failure, especially for London and Paris. The UN pushed for a ceasefire, with the US and the USSR agreeing for once. The Soviets, by the way, had just crushed Hungary and were posing as Egypt's defenders. The Europeans ended up withdrawing on December 22, and the Israelis did the same while destroying infrastructure in the Sinai behind them. Egypt came back to Gaza, but ceased Fedayeen actions and authorized freedom of navigation. The losses were 2,000 to 3,000 Egyptians, 200 Israelis, 22 British, and 10 French. In political terms, it was disastrous for the British, serious for the French, negative for the Israelis, and positive for the Egyptians. With the Israeli withdrawal, UN Blue Helmets were deployed. Eisenhower had to pressure the Israelis to evacuate Sharm el-Sheikh in 1957. The Suez War gave Israel 10 years of peace. The country had impressed Middle Eastern neighbors, notably Iran and Turkey, who developed relations with it. In 1957, Palestinians in Egypt, including Yasser Arafat, created the Fatah, an anti-Israel movement with the Algerian War as its model. Later, in May 1964, the PLO would be created with its key value an undivided Palestine. It had as its charter to take control of the entire pre-1947 territory and in no case recognize Israel. Arafat wasn't its leader at the time but led independent terrorist operations with his Fatah. Palestinian terrorists conducted attacks from Syria and Jordan, and even though King Hussein promised the Israelis to do his best to prevent them, they continued. In November 1965, Israel raided a Jordanian village in response, blowing up houses again, even though Israeli intelligence indicated that recent attacks came from Syria. On the Arab side, Nasser proclaimed the United Arab Republic in January 1958 with Syria, but the project would only last until September 1961, when a succession of coups d'etat put Hafez al-Assad to power. Because Iran was close to Israel, Nasser encouraged Iranian subversion, including Ayatollah Khomeini. The Soviets with Brezhnev thought they could use Nasser to bring revolution to the region. They sent him large quantities of armament, including modern anti-air missiles. As soon as 1966, Nasser thought he could win a war. After evacuating the UN force from the Sinai, he established defense pacts with Syria, Jordan, Libya, Sudan, and Iraq. The Egyptian dictator declared on May 1967 that Egypt's profound objective was Israel's destruction. The Israelis mobilized the same month. They faced 80,000 Egyptians and 950 tanks in the Sinai. Nasser was manipulated by the Soviets and Syrians and made mistakes. They told him Israel was massing its forces against Egypt and Syria, which was false, and provoked an Egyptian mobilization. He completed the war cycle with a new blockade on Aqaba. The Israelis decided for a preemptive strike. Israel began the hostilities in the morning of June 5, 1967 by striking decisively. Israeli aviation struck Egyptian airfields and destroyed 300 of the country's 340 operational aircrafts, including all its long-range bombers. At the end of June 6, they had also destroyed 60 Syrian, 29 Jordanian, 17 Iraqi, and 1 Lebanese airplanes for a loss of 26 of their own. Even radars and missiles had been destroyed. Nasser couldn't believe it was only Sahal's work and accused the West of bringing in aircraft carriers. The forces of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq launched their ground troops. The Jordanians began bombing Jewish neighborhoods in Jerusalem. In a tank battle against the Egyptians, the Israelis destroyed 40 tanks for only 2 of theirs. Sahal reached the Suez Canal, taking Gaza and the entire Sinai from the Egyptians, the West Bank from the Jordanians, and the Golan from the Syrians. Egypt and Jordan agreed to a ceasefire on June 8 and Syria on June 9. The Israeli victory was complete. The Egyptians had lost around 15,000 men, with 50,000 wounded and 11,500 prisoners, as well as 700 tanks and most of its aviation. The Jordanians lost 700 dead and the Syrians 2,000. For Israel, 778 soldiers and 26 civilians died, 250 soldiers and 195 civilians were wounded, and 21 soldiers were taken prisoner. There were especially major changes for territories and population. Israel now controls 68,000 square kilometers and 1 million more Arabs, including 200,000 refugees. The total was 1,385,000 Arabs in Israel, 1 million less than the Jews. It was victory euphoria in Israel. No minister questioned why the country had to occupy land with hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Revisionists like Menahem Begin and other politicians were asking for the liberation of Greater Israel, biblical land which included the West Bank and East Jerusalem. In the West Bank, the Israelis started to settle. The United States were now more strongly behind Israel, saying the conflict was Egypt's fault. The Israeli government nevertheless proposed a formula for restituting territories in exchange for peace guarantees, but Egypt and Syria only wanted unconditional withdrawal. Nasser was already rearming with the Soviets. The Fatah multiplied its bomb attacks, with dozens each month. The PLO was increasingly popular and named Arafat at its head. He refused Israeli proposals for secret negotiations. At the Khartoum summit in 1967, Arab countries voted against recognizing Israel, against reconciliation, and against negotiation. The UN adopted Resolution 242 on November 22, asking for a return of territories seized during the war, a recognition of country sovereignty, freedom of navigation, and solving the refugee problem. There was ambiguity because the English version talked about the return of territories, more ambiguous, and the other version spoke about the return of the territories, meaning all of them, so Israel only agreed to the English version. On September 8, 1968, Egyptian artillery and tanks opened fire along the Canal, killing 28 Israelis. Israel replied with commando raids in the Nile Valley. They established a defense line along the canal called the Bar-Lev Line. Fire exchanges were becoming common, with increasing casualties. In reaction to Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine attacks on civilian airplanes, Prime Minister Eskol approved a reprisal operation against the Beirut airport. They blew up 13 Arab airliners. In South Lebanon, Palestinian commandos fired rockets in December and Israel responded. Anti-Israel terrorist attacks multiplied abroad, notably with shots on airplanes and grenade attacks on the embassies. In April 1969, Egypt announced that the 1967 ceasefire was invalid. The USSR agreed to supply a massive material aid. The Soviets would even pilot planes and crew anti-air missiles at the beginning. Israel stopped its raids to avoid the confrontation with Moscow. The new Nixon government in Washington proposed in 1969 an accord project including ceasefire, accepting Resolution 242, including returning occupied territories, and forbidding movements of troops and materials. Prime Minister Golda Meir refused but ended up agreeing to give her country respite and help its reputation abroad. Nasser immediately agreed but cheated by developing fake missile sites before the agreement, and after it he had them replaced by real weapons. The Israelis had 500 dead and 2,000 wounded along the canal in the last few years. In the next months, the Egyptians doubled their entire air system. Palestinian terrorist groups were still blowing up airplanes and took hundreds of hostages, despite Arafat's opposition. Hussein of Jordan declared martial law against Palestinian movements on September 16, 1970. The Arab Legion launched an offensive against Palestinian camps. Then, on September 20, Syria responded by sending 200 tanks against Jordan. Jordan ended up fighting back Syria alone and did not hesitate to fire on refugee camps with heavy weapons. Several Fadayan fighters fled to other countries, including Israel, referring this to Jordanian prisons. A ceasefire was announced on the 27th. While Israel wanted to maintain the status quo in the region and that the Americans and Soviets were preoccupied with their détente, Egyptian President Sadat, who took power after Nasser's death, wanted a war with limited objectives to force the situation. The Egyptians and Syrians reinforced their fronts in 1972. Generals Ismail and Shazli planned to avoid the type of war Israel excelled, mobile war with technical means. They wanted to mobilize anti-air defenses to neutralize the Israeli aviation. The Israelis were confident to succeed against any event, but didn't think that Sadat, who openly said that war was inevitable, would attack. In the summer of 1973, Egyptian and Syrian forces further reinforced, but Israel still focused on terrorist attacks. Reports from outposts, the Mossad, and even the CIA talking about an impending offensive were discarded. Meir finally decided to deploy the reserves, which probably saved the country. The Egyptians and Syrians began the war on October 6, 1973. The most serious threat was in the Golan, where the Israelis had meager forces with 177 tanks against 1,000 Syrian tanks with 500 in reserve. The Syrians managed to break through and the Israelis were in a bad spot. The situation was reversed on October 9 as General Peled advanced and began a pincer maneuver against the Syrians, who left 867 tanks and thousands of guns and vehicles. The Israelis managed to restore their initial situation on the Golan. The situation in the Sinai was also serious, but not as dangerous for the country. Against relatively unprotected Israeli outposts along the Canal, Egypt massed 8 divisions with 2,200 tanks, 230 guns, 150 anti-air missiles, and 550 planes. Their plan was to cross the canal on a broad front, penetrate several miles east of it, repulse counterattacks with defensive positions established in the west, and after 10 days begin the advance and capture Israeli positions. Initial Egyptian success was surprising, with 90,000 men and 850 tanks east of the canal in 24 hours, with 300 Israeli tanks lost. The seriousness of the situation wasn't realized until the next day, and Israeli aviation was prioritizing the Golan. The Israelis pondered as to which front to prioritize. General Gonen on the 9th wanted to go on the defensive to build up his forces and was frustrated when General Sharon bypassed his orders to attack with big losses as a result. The situation was stabilized on the 10th. The aviation, which had concentrated on the Golan and suffered serious losses to AA missiles, would concentrate on their destruction. Minister Dayan approved the counteroffensive plan against the Syrians on the 11th. They struck them and on the 12th were beyond the pre-war border, up to 30 miles from Damascus. Syria agreed to a ceasefire on the 22nd. The Iraqis and Jordanians also sent smaller forces totaling hundreds of tanks, but were easily beaten. Sahel could now turn against Egypt. In the Sinai, we had on the 14th the largest tank battle since Kursk, with around 2,000 from all sides. The Israelis performed well again with the help of their air force. Americans and Soviets were supplying large quantities of weapons by air to their respective allies to account for losses. Israel counterattacked on the night of the 15th to the 16th by crossing the canal with difficulty. By the 19th, they had encircled large Egyptian units and almost reached Suez itself. There was a decrease in combat when the UN adopted Resolution 338, which was to take effect on the 22nd. Combat increased again as the encircled Egyptians wanted to escape, and the Israelis took advantage of this to continue their advance before a second ceasefire on the 24th with Resolution 339. The first ceasefire failure and Israel's apparent disregard for it provoked an international crisis. The Soviets threatened to intervene unilaterally to stop the fighting. This led the Americans to put their troops on a state of alert to keep them at bay. Finally, a UN forces which excluded the two powers was agreed to. It's only in 1974 that an agreement was reached, and Israel withdrew from the Sinai at the condition that Egypt limited its forces there. There was meanwhile a confrontation between Middle Eastern countries and the West, with the first imposing an oil embargo to force the second to agree to their terms. The Kippur War has been one of the most intense in history. Arab countries lack unified and decisive command. Egypt and Syria began with 2,200 and 2,000 tanks respectively, and lost 2,000 in total, while the Israelis began with 1,700 and lost half of them. Egypt and Syria lost 250 planes out of their 800, and Israel 115 out of 500, mostly from air defense. The two Arab countries lost 8,000 dead and Israel 2,500, less than the Arabs but more in proportion. The losses had a large psychological impact in Israel. There was immediately a hunt for the guilty targeting Meir and Dayan, leading to the first Likud victory in 1977. The Americans Kissinger and Nixon were sometimes uncompromising with Meir and conditioned their military deliveries to Israeli willingness to cooperate on peace efforts. Sadat received Kissinger and began a rapprochement with Washington, saying the Soviets didn't support him enough. The Egyptian president organized a conference for peace in Geneva, but Meir didn't want to go because the Palestinians were there. Nixon had to threaten her, saying it was ridiculous. Kissinger worked hard to bring in all relevant countries except Syria. In February 1974, young Jewish nationalist militants created the movement Gush Emunim, or Bloc of the Faithful, with its objective of installing Jewish towns in the West Bank, the Sinai, Gaza, and the Golan, and prevent any Israeli concession or withdrawal. The government at the beginning opposed them, even sending the army to evacuate them. Jimmy Carter, new US president in 1977, was the first to call for a Palestinian national home. The election of Menachem Begin of the Likud in the same year complicated things even more. The Likud's right wing considered the whole region as belonging to Israel and gave Gush Emunim legitimacy. Palestinians became Arabs in the land of Israel. Begin, however, declared himself disposed to negotiate with Sadat as the latter made a conciliatory speech. The two governments began meetings in the summer of 1977. Sadat suddenly decided to visit Israel in November without warning his government. The whole thing seemed unreal. He was welcomed with honors and Begin congratulated him for his courage. The president went to the Holocaust Memorial before laying flowers on the unknown soldier's tomb and going to the Knesset. He gave a pretty hard speech, but by going there, he recognized the state of Israel. Sadat was sitting between Begin, former Irgun leader, and Shamir, formerly a member of Lehi. Both heads of state repeated no more wars between our two people. Meanwhile, Palestinian attacks kept on. On March 11, 1978, 11 Palestinians landed on a beach in the Mahan Mikhael Natural Reserve. They killed a young American photographer who was taking pictures of birds. They shot on cars before capturing buses and hostages. In fire exchanges with security forces, the bus caught on fire. Parents tried to save their children by throwing them out of the windows. A Palestinian woman outside took them and threw them back inside. There were 37 hostages killed and 78 wounded, and on the terrorist side, 9 killed and 3 captured. It was a casus belli. 5 days later, Tzahal began an operation in Lebanon, raking the area and capturing hundreds of Palestinian fighters. To prevent a deterioration in Israeli-Egyptian talks, Carter decided to take charge and invited them to a meeting at Camp David on September 5, 1978. He managed after long disagreements to produce concessions from both sides, including an Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. An agreement was concluded on September 17 for establishing Israeli, Egyptian, Jordanian, Palestinian negotiations for solving the Palestinian issue, with autonomy for the territories during an interim period, joint security forces, using Resolution 242 as a basis, and to guarantee a legitimate Palestinian right to determine their future. The second document was a framework to reach an Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement. The Knesset approved both. The group Gush Emunim obviously spoke of this as treason. The peace accord was signed on March 26, 1979 between the two countries, and Arab League countries broke off their relations with Egypt. For the first time since 1948, Israel had established formal relations with an Arab country. Sadat and Begin proclaimed no more wars. Settlements in the Sinai would be evacuated in 1982. On October 6, 1981, Sadat was assassinated by Islamist commandos. Many world leaders, including Begin, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, came to the funerals, but the only Arab leader present was the Sudanese president. There wasn't a large crowd for the man who lost his popularity to attain peace. Meanwhile, there had been a revolution in Iran. Thousands of protesters led by Palestinians took the Israeli embassy and raised their flag. It was the end of 25 years of close relations. Iran immediately began supporting the PLO and only broke off relations when Arafat began negotiating with Israel. Nearby in Iraq, the Israeli Air Force destroyed on June 7, 1981 a nuclear reactor supplied by France to avoid a nuclear threat. We progressively came to war in Lebanon. The PLO, expelled from Jordan, had moved its activities there. Some Lebanese were sympathetic, but the Christians were hostile, the Maronites wanted them expelled, and even southern Shia Muslims didn't like them because of the way the Palestinians abused the populations. In the 1970s, the Palestinian case was seemingly gaining in benefits. Arab countries were becoming richer, West European countries were more favorable, and Cuba and 27 African countries broke off their relations with Israel. The Mossad secretly sent arms, including heavy weapons, to Christian Falangist militias in Lebanon. The Syrians had intervened in 1976 to establish their control and were seen as occupiers. The PLO launched waves of rockets and Sahel replied with incursions. An assassination attempt against the Israeli ambassador in London by Palestinian extremists on June 3, 1982 gave Israel the excuse to enter the war directly in Lebanon. The aviation began first, followed by land forces on the 5th. Syrian aviation tried to intervene but was easily beaten. Christian leader Bashir Gemayel wanted to take power but didn't want to seem as an Israeli ally. On the other side, the Israelis were furious that his liberation movement wasn't doing much. Many Christians and Southern Muslims saw the Israelis as liberators, but as the battle for Beirut began with bombardments on August 12, world opinion turned against Israel. Gemayel, meanwhile, was elected president of Lebanon on August 23. US President Reagan was for a withdrawal of all foreign troops from Lebanon and Begin agreed. There was still fighting going on though. Assad of Syria was tired of Arafat and sent militias to get rid of him, but in a weird turn of events, France and Saudi Arabia intervened to help him evacuate Lebanon, with the Israelis choosing not to interfere. Gemayel wanted to expel Palestinian refugee camps Sabra and Shatila, which armed men were using as bases to fire weapons. He was killed by the Syrians. His Falangist forces came for vengeance and began a massacre in the two camps on September 16. Numbers of civilians killed ranged from 700 to 3,500. The Israelis didn't raise a finger and began inflaming critics by saying, "Goyim are killing Goyim." The Shia Lebanese community, which had been passive during the war, was beginning to become more active, encouraged by Iran to organize extremist networks, notably the Hezbollah. The civil war continued and the Israelis couldn't ensure stability. This situation led to Yitzhak Shamir becoming the new PM. He disengaged from the conflict by June 1985. With Arafat now in Tunis, the Israelis tried several times to assassinate him. On October 1, 1985, they sent F-15s up to his HQ for an airstrike, which killed 50 Palestinians and Tunisians but missed him. Secret contacts nevertheless began between Israel and the PLO in June of the same year. The Americans worked to organize a diplomatic initiative on Palestinian autonomy, but wanted the PLO to renounce terrorism and adopt Resolution 242. The Palestinian stalemate was broken in a surprising manner even for the PLO in December 1987 with the beginning of the Intifada. The Israelis had been occupying the territories for 20 years and never had more than sporadic violence. In October 1987, Islamic Jihad terrorists were killed by the Shin Bet, leading to Palestinians demonstrating and giving jihadi speeches and call for vengeance, with rock throwing on soldiers. There was an increase in attacks on the Israelis. On October 8, a truck driven by an Israeli struck a cab transporting Gaza workers, resulting in 4 deaths. It led to riots and overwhelmed soldiers fired shots. Israel poorly understood the situation and soldiers were not qualified for crowd control, so they answered with gunfire. Palestinian violence at the beginning was mostly rock throwing. International reactions, including from Jewish communities abroad, condemned the Israeli response. There were mass arrests, police abuse, and deportations. The PLO did not initiate the Intifada but took control of it. After 2 years, there were 500 dead and 7,000 wounded. The Islamists would gain influence and executed anyone suspected of collaborating with Israel, so Arafat in comparison could proclaim to be more moderate. This is where Hamas was born. It advocated for destroying Israel, killing Jews, and imposing Islam. The Jordanians, who still had a large Palestinian population on their soil, decided in July 1988 to completely disengage from the Palestinian problem. It was easier now for the PLO to speak about the state and accept Resolution 242. Prime Minister Shami at the beginning refused any Palestinian autonomy. Arafat began to develop relations with Saddam Hussein, who posed as a champion of the Palestinians and threatened Israel with missiles. The new US President Bush was clearly less pro-Israeli than Reagan and criticized Jewish settlements, which had 88,000 settlers in 1990. Despite Saddam Hussein's threat of destroying Israel, the Jewish government took him lightly as he was busy on rebuilding after his war with Iran. As Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, Israel prepared for military measures, but the Americans were trying to build a coalition with Arab countries against Saddam and didn't want an Israeli implication to break it. The Israelis had to remain calm, even as the Iraqis fired Scud missiles on their territory. Arafat was weakened diplomatically for his support for Saddam. It didn't prevent Secretary Baker from working with the Jordanians to organize a conference in Madrid between the Israelis and Palestinians. Yitzhak Rabin was elected Prime Minister in 1992 and established a secret negotiation channel in Norway the next year. He was for limiting settlements and was against the Greater Israel because it would mean a binational state. He was for giving back Golan to Syria in exchange for security guarantees. Arafat revised the PLO charter to stop terrorism, calm the Intifada, recognize Israel and UN resolutions, and asked for stopping the boycott on Israel. On February 25, 1994, a terrorist attack by the young Jewish man Baruch Goldstein in a mosque in Hebron killed 29 and wounded 125. It hurt the peace process and started a series of Palestinian suicide attacks. This did not prevent, however, the signing of several accords. Oslo I on September 13, 1993 for establishing a framework for solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Gaza-Jericho Accord on May 4, 1994 to define Palestinian autonomy, and Oslo II on September 28, 1995 to establish definite areas in Palestinian territories for sharing administrative and security authorities. The PLO pledged to cooperate and protected Israeli soldiers who were withdrawing from the crowd. Arafat, Rabin, and his minister Peres received the Nobel Peace Prize. There were, however, extremists on both sides who were against any concession and organized violent actions. Jordan, meanwhile, signed in 1994 with Israel an agreement to finally establish formal diplomatic relations. It was euphoria for the peace camp in Israel, but Jewish extremists said the Torah forbade from giving back any territory. Some rabbis even called for the PM's death. This is what happened on November 4. Rabin was assassinated by a young Jewish extremist for his quest for peace. It led to national mourning. Heads of states who came to the funerals, including Arab leaders such as Mubarak, Hussein of Jordan, and representatives from Morocco, Oman, Qatar, and other places. Arafat wanted to come, but the Israelis didn't want to for security reasons. The new PM Peres clung to Rabin's red lines, which included no withdrawal to pre-1967 lines, Jerusalem would still be the country's capital, there would be no foreign army between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, there would be no massive influx of Palestinian refugees in Israel, and most settlements would be maintained. On January 1996, the Israelis killed Yehia Hayash, who managed Hamas suicide attacks. There were then in Gaza real national funerals with a crowd of 100,000 people. Arafat was among them, which was used by the Israeli right to say he was pro-Islamist. Arafat was in a delicate position. He had to cooperate with the Israelis for autonomy, but he had to display an anti-Israeli posture to avoid going against his population. Hamas continued its terrorist attacks, resulting in lower popularity for Peres. Arafat saw this could put the Israeli right in power and decided to neutralize Hamas by cooperating with the Shin Bet to arrest 2,000 militants. More troubles emerged in South Lebanon. Tzahal occupied an area there and was attacked by the Hezbollah, which fired rockets on Israel. The army executed Operation Grapes of Wrath, a bombing on the south on April 11, which provoked 200,000 refugees in an effort to push the Lebanese government to put pressure on Hezbollah. A ceasefire began on April 27 after 154 dead and 350 wounded. Benjamin Netanyahu took advantage of insecurity to gain right-wing voters, and civilian deaths in Lebanon led Arab-Israeli voters to boycott the election. Netanyahu was elected on May 29 with support from the ultra-Orthodox and the settlement movement. The new PM was opposed to the peace process, but with two-thirds of his population in favor of the Oslo Accords, he continued the process. Nevertheless, Netanyahu wasn't a pragmatist, but rather an ideologue. He was opposed to a Palestinian state, wanted to continue settlements as outposts for Israel's defense, and said it was a natural process. It made it hard for the Palestinian Authority, with people calling for an uprising. The PM made a mistake in September 1996 in the opening of a tunnel towards the Western Wall in Jerusalem, which led to a violent cycle ending with armed fighting with 80 Palestinians and 15 Israeli soldiers dead. American President Clinton summoned Netanyahu and Arafat in Washington to restart negotiations. The Israeli PM ended up agreeing to withdraw from Hebron in January 1997. The Palestinians were glad, but soon after, the Israelis built new Jewish neighborhoods south of Jerusalem in violation of the Oslo Accords. Netanyahu talked about unifying Jerusalem and criticized the left, who he said wanted appeasement. He accused the Palestinian Authority every time a terrorist attack happened, going against military intelligence reports. After a Hamas attack which killed 13 and wounded 170, he suspended contacts with the Palestinian Authority. At a peace summit in White Plantation, Netanyahu was acting so much in bad faith that Clinton overtly criticized him. With new elections in May 1999, the military was against the PM because he didn't listen to experts and focused on communications. He had before him Ehud Barak, the most decorated soldier in the history of the country, and who won on May 17. Barak was for continuing the peace process, but was far from a pacifist and wouldn't make concessions when security was at play. He laid down 4 red lines for the country: a unified Jerusalem under Israeli authority as capital of the country, no return to 1967 borders, no foreign army west of the Jordan River, and most inhabitants and settlements in the West Bank would be under Israeli sovereignty. Arafat was not reassured. Barak immediately had good relations with Clinton, however, and was ready to negotiate. A new accord was reached and decreased Israeli control in the West Bank from 72% to 59% in early 2000. The PM decided to evacuate some illegal settlements, and right-wing militants had to be removed by force. The Palestinians were becoming impatient because the withdrawal schedule was not respected and settlements continued. There were in the meantime secret negotiations in Sweden, the Stockholm Channel. On May 15, 2000, demonstrations commemorating the Arab defeat of 1948 degenerated in exchange of fire, with losses on both sides. In Gaza and the West Bank, several organizations set out camps training the youth to show the AK-47 rifles, and this was abundantly filmed by the press. There was a strange episode of the peace process in Camp David in July. Clinton wanted to solve the conflict in a few weeks before ending his term. Him and Secretary Albright worked hard to reach an agreement, but there were irreconcilable interests around Jerusalem and the conference was a failure. There was at the time in Israel a demonstration with 150,000 people against territorial concessions. Troubles began again as Ariel Sharon, leader of the opposition, wanted to visit the Temple Mount to score political points. Sharon was particularly hated by the Palestinians because he was the one who gave the order not to interfere with the massacre of Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon. He visited the place on September 28. Young Palestinians started throwing rocks on the police and on Jewish visitors down the West Wall. The police chief was wounded at the head, and without leadership, police officers started shooting with bullets. There were 4 dead and 160 wounded for the Palestinians and 14 injured police officers. Demonstrations broke out everywhere in the territories. In Gaza, automatic gunfire erupted. A father and his son were struck in a fire zone and fatally hurt. The scene was filmed and circulated around the world. It led to a chain reaction and the beginning of the Second Intifada. Palestinians were screaming revenge. In a week, there were 58 Palestinians and 5 Israelis killed. This disproportion was because of the power difference, but it was terrible for Israel's image. There were hundreds of attacks on both sides during the 5 years of this Intifada. It almost always followed the same pattern. First a Palestinian terrorist attack, then an Israeli response, sometimes on terrorist targets, but sometimes on Palestinian Authority targets, and almost always with collateral victims. I cannot go over all of them, but I'll give you some examples. On October 5, Palestinians fired on a Jewish neighborhood. On the 12th, 2 Israeli soldiers took the wrong road and ended up in a Palestinian police station in Ramallah. A crowd arrived and lynched them, with everything filmed. Barak reacted by bombing the police station and other objectives in Gaza and Ramallah. The Arab League suspended economic cooperation with Israel, talking about an Israeli war against the Palestinian people and saluting the Intifada. The Israeli government accused the Palestinian Authority of starting the Intifada, but intelligence agencies certified then and later that this wasn't the case. They knew that factors for violence were there before. Arafat did not start the Intifada, but he and his forces were not trying to stop the attacks. He saw that it attracted international attention and sympathy for the Palestinian cause. Even when his police forces arrested terrorists, they were put on probation and released. On November 20, some Palestinians fired mortar rounds on a school bus in the settlement. 2 teachers and 5 children were killed. Israel responded with airstrikes on Fatah buildings. The year 2000 ended with 300 Palestinians and 40 Israelis killed, thousands wounded, continuous terrorist attacks, insecurity, and blame exchange. On February 6, 2001, Ariel Sharon was easily elected. He was notably supported by security forces and started an even harder war on Palestinian organizations. Israel reached a psychological win by persuading people with repeated accusations that Arafat had started the Intifada. Israel military thinkers were following low-intensity conflict theories and wanted to engrave on the Palestinian heads that they wouldn't obtain anything with violence. This meant pressure on the populations, with curfews and cordons, which provoked an enormous economic crisis. In the United States, Security Powell wanted a ceasefire, even a political agreement, but Bush was new to foreign policy and had in his administration strongly pro-Israel and pro-settlement people like Wolfowitz, Pearl, and Faith. On March 4, Hamas killed 3 elderly men and injured 60 in Netanyahu. In Naplouse and Gaza, some people came out to applaud this vengeance. If there's a word to remember about this conflict, it would be this: vengeance. In the Hebron settlement, a 10-month-old girl was killed by a Palestinian sniper in the arms of her father. Arafat, meanwhile, was only vaguely condemning terrorism and criticized Israel without intervening. Assad of Syria was more popular in Arab countries, saying that Israeli society was more racist than the Nazis. Tzahal restarted targeted assassinations on April the 3rd, notably with airstrikes and car bombs. On May 14, there was a new Israeli blunder when 5 innocent Palestinian police officers were killed because of bad intelligence. On May 18, a Hamas attack killed 5 and injured 100. Israel answered with airstrikes. In May, the American George Mitchell published a report saying there was no proof of Intifada planning by the Palestinian Authority, but also no proof of efforts to stop it. Israeli soldiers were overly aggressive because they weren't sued after civilian deaths. He recommended to the Palestinians to punish the terrorists and to the Israelis to stop settlements. The Bush administration adopted the report. Sharon didn't like the part on freezing settlements and criticism of the military, but to avoid the crisis with the United States, he stopped preemptive operations. Israel wanted the end of violence as a precondition for negotiations, while the Palestinians wanted political negotiations before ending violence. The Palestinian leader accused the Israelis of attacking Palestinians with all means, saying, "Our economy is destroyed and our children can go to school because tanks are preventing them." Minister Perez answered, "Give us 1 week without ambulances, without tears from mourning mothers. We pray so there would be no bombs placed in nightclubs, schools, or shopping malls, and that people could move without fear of getting killed. Give us security, you'll get freedom." Sharon wanted visible military operations to show a hardening posture to his population. The military proposed to strike Hamas sheikhs Jamal Mansour and Jamal Salim. An helicopter fired a missile on their building on July 31, killing them on the spot along with 3 assistants, a journalist, and 2 kids playing on the street. Tzahal said they were plotting attacks. This was done without consulting military intelligence or the Shin Bet. As the latter certified, Mansour was one of the most moderates in Hamas, didn't plan attacks, and was publicly for negotiations. The following day, a crowd of 100,000 people were at the funeral screaming vengeance. On August 9, a terrorist attack in Jerusalem killed 15 civilians and wounded 110. After the 2 Jamals' assassination, there was again a hunt for traitors among Palestinians, with fake tribunals and summary executions. September 9 was particularly bloody. The Islamic Jihad fired with automatic weapons on a schoolteacher bus, killing 2. Tzahal responded with missiles. Hamas killed 3 and wounded 90 in Nahariya. Israel's spokesperson still accused Arafat of being behind that. With the 9/11 attacks, Sharon knew that the media equation had changed, and that the Israeli responses to terrorist attacks wouldn't be so criticized. He said there was no difference between the New York attacks and those in Israel. Arafat called for breaking the violence cycle and ordered his security forces to respect the ceasefire. Tzahal did the same and gunfight diminished. Other groups violated the ceasefire. Arafat's forces were sent to repress Gaza students who brandished Bin Laden portraits. Still, his forces continued releasing terrorists. On December the 1st, a Hamas attack in Jerusalem killed 11 and wounded 188. Sharon wanted to communicate that his fight was the same as the US. On the following day, Hamas killed 15 and wounded 40 in Haifa. Arafat declared the state of emergency in Palestinian territories, forbidding demonstrations and carrying weapons, and the police started arresting Islamist militants. On January 2, 2002, Israel declared having found proof of Arafat's involvement. The ship Karen A, Palestinian and affiliated to Iran, was monitored and intercepted. It contained heavy weapons, and the captain said they were to be delivered to the Palestinian Authority. Arafat denied any implication. After a series of attacks, Israel launched Operation Defensive Shield. They besieged Arafat's HQ and entered deeply into the territories. After an intervention from British and American agents to reach a compromise on wanted Palestinians, Tzahal ended the siege after 34 days. Operation Defensive Shield ended up with 265 deaths, civilians and combatants, on the Palestinian side, and 29 Israeli soldiers. During the same period, 33 Israeli civilians were killed by suicide attacks. Under pressure from the international community, Arafat didn't have a choice but to reform Palestinian institutions, notably to unify security, which was divided in 12 organizations. On June 5, a 16-year-old Palestinian from the Islamic Jihad killed 17 people and wounded 40. On June 18, Hamas blew up a bus, 19 dead and 74 wounded. The following day, an attack by the Al-Aqsa Mortars Brigade resulted in similar numbers. Arafat called to stop these attacks, but to no avail. Hamas' strategy was to continue attacks to show the Palestinians they were fighting, while letting the Israelis respond against the Palestinian Authority to weaken it. On the 20th, two PFLP militants killed a family of 5, including 2 children, in a settlement. In the West Bank, 600,000 Palestinians were blocked by the curfew and could only get out for a few hours to get food. The Palestinian situation was catastrophic, with around 50 to 60% unemployment and a third of children malnourished. Sharon's barrier system was being built and did not always follow the borderline. It often cut into Palestinian fields and destroyed their crops. The line was projected to include settlements. From September 29, 2000 to December 31, 2003, 2,316 Palestinians and 879 Israelis were killed. In secret, Sharon realized he needed to evacuate Gaza settlements. The right was outraged with this possibility, saying it went against Zionism and rewarded terrorism. The Settlements Council even asked for the PM's resignation. In the line of Ben Gurion and Yigal Allon, Sharon wanted borders for security, not ideology, and didn't want to incorporate Arabs and lose the majority. After yet another Hamas attack, Sharon had Sheikh Yassin, the group's founder, killed on March 22, 2004. The Palestinian Authority, always ambiguous, declared 3 days of mourning. 150,000 people went to the funerals. There were anti-Israeli responses not only in Arab countries but in other regions of the world like the Philippines. Handmade rocket fire from Gaza was answered by incursions, destroyed homes, and targeted assassinations. On October 5, a 13-year-old Palestinian schoolgirl was killed by Tzahal with 20 bullets in her body, including 5 in the head, while no incident had occurred in this sector. An officer was court-martialed and cleared. On November 11, Yasser Arafat died. Mahmoud Abbas was elected president of the authority. He couldn't impose a ceasefire but negotiated a truce for suspending attacks. General Yalon answered by stopping operations in Gaza. This marked the end of the Second Intifada, but never the end of violence. Priority for Hamas was not political. The movement won most municipal elections in the territories and established a unity government with the Fatah. On February 8, 2005 in Egypt, Sharon and Abbas announced a ceasefire. There was still sparse violence. The Islamic Jihad notably didn't accept the agreement, and Israel still targeted its members. The Israeli withdrawal from Gaza settlements began on August 17, 2005. The nationalist religious movement said it was a crime to abandon territories but couldn't rally public opinion. 2,800 houses had to be destroyed. It ended on September 12 after having to send security forces to remove militants who didn't want to leave. It didn't lead to peace, as 13 days later, rockets were fired on Israel, and Tzahal responded with targeted assassinations. In a bad spot politically and with health issues, Sharon created a new party Kadim and gave the premiership to Ehud Olmert. Olmert saw himself as his successor. He would quickly be challenged by Hamas and Hezbollah, drift towards war in Lebanon, a large operation in Gaza, secret negotiations with Syrians and Palestinians, and ultimately his resignation. The unilateral Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon in 2000 pushed Hezbollah, Iran, and Syria to see this as a confirmation of their doctrine of resistance, Mukawama. Hezbollah kidnapped 3 soldiers in October 2000. Barak and later Sharon were focusing on the Palestinian issue and didn't respond strongly. Hezbollah built an arsenal of missiles and infrastructures, with fortifications network and anti-tank weapons, and began intermittent attacks by May 2005. Intelligence services focused on the Palestinian issue and were surprised. On July 12, 2006, Hezbollah bombed Israeli towns on the border and kidnapped 3 soldiers. Israel this time immediately responded with a massive air campaign, but the group managed to keep most of its short and medium-range missiles and fired 100 each day. The Israelis hesitated to start a land operation and only approved it on August 9. The operation wasn't completed because of UN's Resolution 1701 adopted on August 11. The war ended with 156 Israelis killed, including 117 soldiers, for 700 enemy fighters killed. There's controversy on Lebanese civilian deaths, with some estimates going up to 1,000. Material damage was considerable in both countries. Sahal's low-intensity conflict doctrine didn't work. Lebanon was a failed state, and Hezbollah kept its offensive capability and rearmed with Iran and Syria. Olmert wanted to break the Iran-Syria-Hezbollah axis with negotiations with Assad. The Palestinian Unity Government fell on June 2007, with Hamas keeping Gaza and the Fatah the West Bank. The two even went to war briefly over Gaza. Iran had been developing its relationship with the Hamas since the 1990s despite the religious difference, simply by hostility to Israel. Tehran also supported other groups like the Islamic Jihad. There was a turning point in 2012 when Hamas broke off its relation on religious ground because of the Syrian civil war, but as we saw, Tehran maintained links for its interests. The relation with the Palestinian Authority remains tense, and Iran says Hamas is the true Palestinian representative. Israel preferred a weak Hamas than a power void, and focused on Iran and the Hezbollah. Hamas nevertheless managed in the long term to militarily reinforce itself for operations. The Israelis focused on the rocket threat with their Iron Dome and on tunnels, but not on a land attack. On September 6, 2007, Israel bombed a North Korean nuclear reactor under construction in Syria. Olmert wanted to go through the UN, but it was clear it wouldn't have allowed him. Each side wanted to minimize media attention on the strike, Assad to avoid responding and be embarrassed. Talks continued nevertheless, but Syria was asking for a return to 1967 lines. In his relationship with the Palestinians, Olmert met with Abbas 36 times between August 2006 and September 2008. Abbas was seen as weak and needed international support to survive in front of Hamas. Bush tried bringing an agreement on the Palestinian issue by organizing the Annapolis Conference in November 2007. It ended with a joint declaration for launching bilateral negotiations. These negotiations in 2008 didn't lead to anything because of disagreements surrounding settlements. There was still the question of Jerusalem and refugees. On September 16, 2008, Olmert made a final offer, but Abbas refused, hoping to get better terms with the next American administration. A mistake. As Egypt realized that Hamas was supported by Iran and wanted to destabilize the Mubarak regime, it shut down its border with Gaza, making life even more miserable without bothering border trafficking. In response to an Israeli attack on trafficking tunnels, Hamas fired a great number of rockets in December 2008, notably 60 on the 24th, for a total of 1,270 during the year. Israel launched in response Operation Cast Lead. Sahal wanted to minimize casualties by using heavy weapons, but Hamas mostly avoided combat, and there was more destroyed infrastructure than anything. It led to a loss of international prestige. Barack Obama came to power in 2009 and wanted to change the dynamic in the Middle East, hoping to solve the conflict, but as we'll see, with few results. Benjamin Netanyahu came back to power in March 2009, saying that his warnings against territorial concessions were vindicated. Rocket attacks and the nuclear Iran threat sent voters to the right. He said that Palestinians weren't ready to a compromise to end the conflict, they wouldn't accept Israel as a Jewish state, and Jerusalem should be unified under Israeli control. He offered an alternative to the Land for Peace policy, saying that the country could become a Western-style country and do business with the Arab world while pushing the Palestinians. He had at the beginning a poor relationship with Obama because of divergent interests, but both wanted to get off past policies. Obama wanted a freeze in settlements, but this issue blocked everything else. The Israeli PM said the freeze would only come with an accord on Palestinian status, but softened his position by announcing a freeze on November 25 for 10 months. Israeli and Palestinian positions were still irreconcilable. Mahmoud Abbas was criticized in his own movement and saw the threat posed by the Hamas. He showed his weakness by asking Arab countries for permission to enter negotiations with Netanyahu. Despite American efforts, they couldn't even agree on a negotiation framework. Abbas asked for a return to 1967 borders, settlement exchange one for one, while Netanyahu asked for recognizing Israel as a Jewish state and national home for the Jewish people. Hamas and other groups were trying to prevent dialogue with the terrorism campaign, notably by firing 680 rockets in 2011. By December 2010, and especially beginning in 2011, uprisings began in several Middle Eastern countries facing corruption and authoritarianism, leading to either reforms to stay in power, like Morocco, to the strongmen stepping down in Egypt, or massive repression like in Libya and Syria. In the US, the neocons are a confirmation of their democratization efforts, and the liberals supported democratic movements. With the Arab uprisings, the Palestinian issue went to the background. Anti-Israel groups, more radical than the country's leaders, gained importance. With the Syrian civil war, Israel especially wanted to counter Iran and was content with targeted missile strikes. It's important to mention, Israel also sent humanitarian and medical aid to Syrian civilians. They led a considerable effort with Operation Good Neighbor in 2016, helping thousands of people until the end of 2018 with Assad's takeover of southern Syria. The key to Netanyahu's Palestinian policy was divide and conquer, so maintaining relations with the authority while letting Hamas keep Gaza. He thought of containing Hamas with a naval and economic blockade as well as defense systems on the border, with periodic raids on fighters and infrastructures. This tactic was nicknamed Mowing the Lawn. A low-intensity conflict was more desirable than politically costly peace accords or a risk of war. I'll talk about this later. In November 2012, Israel responded to rocket fire with Operation Pillar of Cloud. Several hundred civilians were killed or wounded. International reaction was generally outraged, but most Western countries talked about Israel's right to defend itself. Several civilians were victims of defective Hamas rockets. During the operation, Palestinian groups fired 1,456 rockets, including 142 which fell in Gaza. 6 Israeli civilians were killed and 240 wounded. 8 Palestinians were executed for collaborating with Israel. In parallel, a Palestinian attack on a bus killed 28 civilians. In July 2014, we had a similar scenario, this time with Operation Protective Edge. It resulted with more than 2,000 deaths in Gaza, and for once, estimates from both sides match. Mohammed Deif, leader of Hamas military branch, refused 9 ceasefire propositions from Netanyahu. He noticed that images of civilian victims from Israeli bombings shared in the media around the world hurt international support for Israel. US President Trump was largely more aligned with Israel and reversed US policy by recognizing the Golan annexation and by moving the embassy to Jerusalem. From March 2018 to December 2019, tens of thousands protested in the territories for returning refugees and against the blockade on Gaza. Hamas took advantage of this with militants attacking security forces. The Israelis sometimes responded with bullets, leading to more than 200 deaths, which was largely criticized. In 2018, Netanyahu passed a law defining Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. Despite this law, there was little reaction worldwide. This brings us to the apartheid question. Many say that Israel had established an apartheid system against the Arab population. This is honestly false, and if you follow the video, you know that I'm not an Israel apologist. In Israel, you cannot talk about apartheid. If the nation-state law of 2018 took away some community rights from non-Jews, all individual rights were maintained. This includes the right to vote, and there have been Arab parties for decades, as I already mentioned, notably the United Arab List. We even had Prime Minister Bennett's coalition in 2021 that included an Arab party. We're light years away from the situation in South Africa. Now to get back to Netanyahu's policy of dividing Palestinians. The objective of his government is to prevent at all costs the creation of a Palestinian state, so by maintaining 2 separate authorities in Gaza and the West Bank. According to international law, criteria for an entity to legally be a state are a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. The Palestinians are faring pretty badly in this, and by maintaining 2 competing authorities, Israel can prevent legal statehood. International recognition has absolutely no impact on the legal side. No matter how many countries recognize Palestine as a state, it's not. Meanwhile, Israel can continue its settlements without impeding on another state. While the Palestinian Authority cut salaries to Gaza employees in 2018, Netanyahu agreed for Qatar to supply millions of dollars to Hamas. In 2019, he said at the Likud conference, anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state has to support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas. This is part of our strategy, to isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank. Former PM Ehud Olmert said in 2023, Israel did everything to downgrade the Palestinian Authority and to boost Hamas. Gaza was on the brink of collapse because they had no resources, they had no money, and the Palestinian Authority refused to give Hamas any money. Bibi saved them. Bibi made a deal with Qatar and they started to move millions and millions of dollars to Gaza. Even Sharon in 2005 refused that the newly formed police force from the Palestinian Authority goes to Gaza to keep the peace in the same optic. Despite that, Arab countries continued their relations with Israel for their interests. In August 2020, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Sudan, and Morocco agreed to recognize Israel and establish relations with the famous Abraham Accords mediated by the United States, all without solving the Palestinian question. In 2021, the new government of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid didn't change Netanyahu's policy foundations, and the latter came back to power in 2022. In May 2021, with Palestinian protests in Al-Aqsa, the Israeli police raided a mosque, leading to fighting in several Israeli mixed towns. Hamas seized the moment to launch missiles on Jerusalem, leading to another series of responses. There was a surprisingly quick ceasefire, and Qatar payments continued. We come to the eve of the October 7 attacks. Hamas wanted to take advantage of internal instability in Israel with anti-Netanyahu protests when the PM wanted to limit the Supreme Court's power. Netanyahu ignored warnings from military intelligence, the military chief of staff, and the defense minister, who said the country should avoid looking weak before enemies at the time. Their warnings though were vague and did not report a specific threat from Hamas. Defense Minister Gallant was fired after saying in front of the cameras that the country was divided and vulnerable and that a war was imminent. After spontaneous demonstrations, he was put back in office. Israeli intelligence thought that Hamas' civilian responsibilities had calmed its extremism. In reality, the terrorist group used money and information from Gazans working in Israel to plan its offensive. Its capabilities were not taken into account by the Israelis, but rather an estimate of its intentions. Israeli forces had become too dependent on high-tech defense means, notably sensors, which Hamas targeted. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the horrors of the October 7 attacks were difficult to measure. With almost 1,200 Israelis killed, it corresponded to 42,500 Americans in proportion. I won't go into too much detail about this war because we could follow it day by day and others explained it well. I'll mostly talk about certain aspects. Events are moving day to day and I filmed this video on September 6th, so I apologize if I'm not up to date when you're viewing this. The Israeli campaign in Gaza was extremely destructive. Combat is difficult in Gaza with high urban density, enemy combatants dressed as civilians, the use of civilian buildings and human shields by Hamas, obstructing population evacuation by the group, as well as hundreds of kilometers of tunnels. On the other side, international law is ambiguous on non-state combatants, and Israel takes advantage of it. The Geneva Convention says that the parties must distinguish between civilians and soldiers, and civilian and military places. They must not target civilians or civilian infrastructures which do not directly contribute to military action. Civilians must not be targets to reprisal. It's understood that sometimes civilians and infrastructures would be hit, but the rule says that damages should not be excessive in relation to concrete anticipated military advantages. But what do we do when it's not clearly civilian or military, especially for the aviation which has a hard time distinguishing? The concept of proportion between collateral damage and military benefits is used in a flexible manner by Tzahal, justifying almost anything. As we saw in the past, the Israelis tend to say, "Oh yeah, there's an enemy in that building?" Hamas never planned for shelters or any protection for civilians. Israeli soldiers often show lack of training and leadership. When 3 freed hostages were killed by mistake by soldiers on December 15, 2023, it was a good example. The question of genocide is interesting. We often hear the term genocide used to describe Israeli actions. It's not a good term and it shows a lack of comprehension for war and genocide. In a genocide, the aim is to partially or totally destroy an ethnic group. Right at the beginning of the Gaza campaign, the Israelis called for the population to evacuate. They wouldn't have done that if they wanted a genocide. They would have bombed much more intensively. According to the UN, over 60,000 Palestinians, the vast majority civilians, died in the war. First of all, these numbers come from the Gaza Ministry of Health, so we can doubt its reliability since Hamas was in power since 2007. But to be honest, it's not that much for this type of war. But don't get me wrong, it remains an absolutely terrible situation for the population, and each death is horrible, but still in pragmatic terms, and you may find me heartless to speak about death this way, given Gaza's enormous population density and the use of civilian buildings by Hamas, the number is not that high. We couldn't accuse the Allies in World War II of genocide against the Germans, even when the bombings were far worse than what we see here. So accusing the Israelis of genocide is not adequate. It remains that never have so many Palestinians been killed since the war of 1948, and Israeli actions, blocking humanitarian convoys, encouraging settlements, and not caring about the bombings, can constitute war crimes. Again, we need to be careful with information. The media don't necessarily have an agenda, but tend to publish before asking questions. That is what happened with the story that Israeli troops fired on civilians trying to get humanitarian aid at the US humanitarian convoy. There was no proof of Israeli involvement, and days later the same media outlets retracted their story, saying it was simply gunfire. We must note that accusations of death are almost always by the Gaza Ministry of Health, whose objectivity is doubtful. It's not to say the Israelis are not responsible for gunfire, they admitted so themselves, but we must be careful with quotes from the Gaza government. The US supported Israel, which weakened its standing in the Third World, and as Biden suspended weapons deliveries to pressure Netanyahu, this time it was Israel and the conservatives who were furious. Washington tried to compensate by pushing for a ceasefire, humanitarian convoys, for the Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza after the war, and for Hamas to release hostages. Despite this, even Jordan criticized the Americans and recalled its ambassador in Israel, and Bahrain did the same thing. It was mostly to make a good impression, because in private they were mostly worried about Islamist movements. What remains interesting is the range of anti-Israel hate. 90% of Palestinians don't believe Hamas killed civilians on October 7. In Saudi Arabia, it's 95%. It's pretty incredible. Schools in Gaza tell children from an early age about killing Jews, which is completely crazy. On the other side, the current Israeli government is the most right-wing, racist, and annexationist in the country's history. Members of the Netanyahu government, like the Otzma Yehudit party, want to colonize Gaza. When the Israeli Minister of Finance announces a massive colonization plan of the West Bank, with the avowed objective of crushing the possibility of a Palestinian state, it doesn't help the situation. Another interesting thing is that Arab countries in the region don't want Palestinian refugees. Egypt helped Israel enforce the blockade on Gaza for a year, so it's not surprising. Jordan was almost toppled by Palestinians, as we saw, and Lebanon suffered enormously from Palestinian presence also. Then we had, predictably, a new episode of Israel-Hezbollah war in Lebanon with the same scenario as the previous ones. What is distinguishing now is that Iran did not merely support Hezbollah materially, but even launched in April and October 2024 several hundred missiles and drones on Israel in reaction to the war. Most were downed by the Israeli defenses, but it was the first time since 1991 that this happened. Iran improved its standing by posing as an unconditional defender of Palestinians, and there were even celebrations in the streets from Palestinians and in Arab countries. Iran works to improve its relations with Sunni countries to block normalization with Israel. Even more surprising was Israel's response. You may have noticed that in the past they never shied away from responding in a disproportionate manner, but there they showed restraint and skill with high-precision strikes on the Iranian military objective to show they were better on the technological level. What really surprised me was the Israeli campaign against the Iranian nuclear program. I shouldn't be, because Israel was never shy in the past, but this time it was much harder than against the Iraqis or Syrians. Iran learned their lessons and established a very elaborate and fortified nuclear program. Israel carried out not only airstrikes, but also drone and missile strikes with infiltrators in Iran. Despite ceasefire announcements between Israel and Hamas, the conflict will continue, because the objective of one is the destruction of the other. The Arab-Israeli conflict is not based so much on concrete interests and calculated strategies as much as religion, mythology, and emotion. Its irrational nature is a big reason why it lasted this long. The conflict's duration doesn't come from the oppression of Palestinians or from Palestinian terrorism, but rather by the commitment of two people to an undivided land. Each compromise is denounced on each side as a national and religious treason. We would be tempted to think that leaders are the most extreme and drag their populations into this, but as we saw, it was the leaders who were often more moderate, wanted to negotiate but feared domestic reactions. Israel loves to think of itself as an outpost of the West in a less developed region, and it is a vision the West accepts. Since Israel's beginnings, Arabs saw the country as a cancer, either to treat or, when they accepted its presence, to contain. It's a lasting conflict, and honestly I don't see a way out. Well, this is the end of my video. I hope you liked it because it was actually very depressing to do. To be honest, the more I learn, the less I like both sides. There is no leader I really admire, not Ben Gurion, not Nasser, not Arafat, not Netanyahu, no others. It's a long history of bad faith. As for my next projects, I'm working on a trilogy on the Vietnam War, so stay tuned, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you around.